Reason and Revolution by Herbert Marcuse. Part 2, The Rise of Social Theory. Chapter 1.4, The Foundations of the Dialectical Theory of Society, Marx, Alienated Labor. Marx's writings between 1844 and 1846 treat the form of labor in modern society as constituting the total alienation of man. The employment of this category links Marx's economic analysis with a basic category of the Hegelian philosophy. The social division of labor, Marx declares, is not carried out with any consideration for the talents of individuals and the interest of the whole, but rather takes place entirely according to the laws of capitalist commodity production. Under these laws, the product of labor, the commodity, seems to determine the nature and end of human activity. In other words, the materials that should serve life come to rule over its content and goal, and the consciousness of man is completely made victim to the relationships of material production. The materialistic proposition that is the starting point of Marx's theory thus states: first, a historical fact exposing the materialistic character of the prevailing social order in which an uncontrolled economy legislates over all human relations. At the same time, Marx's proposition is a critical one, implying that the prevailing relation between consciousness and social existence is a false one that must be overcome before the true relation can come to light. The truth of the materialist thesis is thus to be fulfilled in its negation. Marx emphasizes time and again that his materialistic starting point is forced upon him by the materialistic quality of the society he analyzes. He states that he begins with a fact, an economic fact recognized even by classical political economy. As modern society runs its course, the worker becomes the poorer the more wealth he produces, and the more his production increases in power and extent. The worker becomes a cheaper commodity the more commodities he produces. Hand in hand with the exploitation of the objective world goes the depreciation of the human world. Classical political economy, Marx quotes Adam Smith and J.B. Say, admits that even great social wealth means nothing but stationary poverty for the worker. These economists had shown that poverty is not at all the result of adverse external circumstance, but of the prevailing mode of labor itself. In the progressive condition of society, the destruction and impoverishment of the worker is the product of his own labor and of the wealth he has himself produced. Misery thus springs from the nature of the prevailing mode of labor and is rooted in the very essence of modern society. What significance does this mode of labor have as far as the development of man is concerned? With this question, the Marxian theory leaves the plane of political economy. The totality of economic relations, laws, and institutions may not be treated simply as an isolated objective cluster of facts, but as making up a historical form within which men carry on their lives. Freed from the limitations of a specialized science, the economic categories are seen to be determining factors for human existence, even if they denote objective economic facts, as in the case of commodity value ground rent. Far from being a mere economic activity, labor is the existential activity of man, his free conscious activity, not a means for maintaining his life, but for developing his universal nature. The new categories will evaluate the economic reality with a view to what it has made of man, of his faculties, powers, and needs. Marx summarizes these human qualities when he speaks of the universal essence of man. His examination of the economy is specifically carried on with the question in mind whether that economy realizes man's Gattungswesen. These terms point back to Feuerbach and to Hegel. Man's very nature lies in his universality. His intellectual and physical faculties can be fulfilled only if all men exist as men, in the developed wealth of their human resources. Man is free only if all men are free and exist as universal beings. When this condition is attained, life will be shaped by the potentialities of the genus, man, which embraces the potentialities of all the individuals that comprise it. The emphasis on this universality brings nature as well into the self-development of mankind. Man is free if nature is his work and his reality, so that he recognizes himself in a world he has himself made. All this has an obvious resemblance to Hegel's idea of reason. Marx even goes so far as to describe the self-realization of man in terms of the unity between thought and being. The whole problem is, however, no longer a philosophical one, for the self-realization of man now requires the abolition of the prevailing mode of labor, and philosophy cannot deliver this result. The critique does begin in philosophic terms because the enslavement of labor and its liberation are alike conditions that go beyond the framework of traditional political economy and affect the very foundations of human existence, which are the proper domain of philosophy. But Marx departs from the philosophical terminology as soon as he has elaborated his own theory. The critical, transcendental character of the economic categories, hitherto expressed by philosophical concepts, later in his Capital, is demonstrated by the economic categories themselves. Marx explains the alienation of labor as exemplified in, first, the relation of the worker to the product of his labor, and second, the relation of the worker to his own activity. The worker in capitalist society produces commodities. Large-scale commodity production requires capital, large aggregations of wealth used exclusively to promote commodity production. The commodities are produced by independent private entrepreneurs for purposes of profitable sale. The worker labors for the capitalist to whom he surrenders through the wage contract the product of his labor. Capital is power to dispose over the products of labor. The more the worker produces, the greater the power of capital becomes, and the smaller the worker's own means for appropriating his products. Labor thus becomes the victim of a power it has itself created. Marx summarizes this process as follows. The object which labor produces, its product, is encountered as an alien entity, a force that has become independent of its producer. The realization of labor is its objectification. Under the prevailing economic conditions, this realization of labor appears as its opposite, the negation of the laborer. Objectification appears as loss of and enslavement by the object, and appropriation as alienation and expropriation. Once turned to the laws of capitalist commodity production, labor is inevitably impoverished. For the more the worker toils, the more powerful becomes the alien world of objects he produces to oppose him, and the poorer he himself becomes. Marx shows this mechanism at work in the movement of wages. The laws of commodity production, without any external aids, maintain wages at the level of stationary poverty. As a result, the realization of labor appears as negation to such an extent that the worker is negated to the point of starvation. The objectification appears as a loss of the objects to such an extent that the worker is deprived of the most necessary objects of life and labor. Moreover, labor itself becomes an object of which he can make himself master only by the greatest effort and with incalculable interruptions. Appropriation of the object appears as alienation to such an extent that the more objects the worker produces, the less he possesses, and the more he comes under the sway of his product of capital. The worker alienated from his product is at the same time alienated from himself. His labor itself becomes no longer his own, and the fact that it becomes the property of another bespeaks an expropriation that touches the very essence of man. Labor in its true form is a medium for man's true self-fulfillment, for the full development of his potentialities. The conscious utilization of the forces of nature should take place for his satisfaction and enjoyment. In its current form, however, it cripples all human faculties and enjoins satisfaction. The worker does not affirm but contradicts his essence. Instead of developing his free physical and mental energies, he mortifies his body and ruins his mind. He therefore first feels he is with himself when he is free from work and apart from himself when he is at work. He is at home when he does not work and not at home when he does. His working is therefore not done willingly, but under compulsion. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need, but only a means for the satisfaction of wants outside of it. In consequence, man, the worker, feels himself acting freely only in his animal functions like eating, drinking, and begetting, whereas in his human functions he is nothing but an animal. The animal becomes the human, and the human the animal. This holds alike for the worker, the expropriated producer, and for him who buys his labor. The process of alienation affects all strata of society, distorting even the natural functions of man. The senses, the primary sources of freedom and happiness, according to Feuerbach, are reduced to one sense of possessing. They view their object only as something that can or cannot be appropriated. Even pleasure and enjoyment change from conditions under which men freely develop their universal nature into modes of egoistic possession and acquisition. Marx's analysis of labor under capitalism is thus quite deep-seated, going further than the structure of economic relationships to the actual human content. Relations such as those between capital and labor, capital and commodity, labor and commodity, and those between commodities are understood as human relations, relations in man's social existence. Even the institution of private property appears as the product, result, and inevitable consequence of the alienated mode of labor, and derives from the mechanisms of the social mode of production. The alienation of labor leads to the division of labor so characteristic of all forms of class society. Each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. A division that is not overcome when the abstract freedom of the individual is proclaimed in bourgeois society. Labor separated from its object is, in the last analysis, an alienation of man from man. The individuals are isolated from and set against each other. They are linked in the commodities they exchange rather than in their persons. Man's alienation from himself is simultaneously an estrangement from his fellow men. Marx's yearly writings are the first explicit statement of the process of reification, through which capitalist society makes all personal relations between men take the form of objective relations between things. Marx expounds this process in his Capital as the fetishism of commodities. The system of capitalism relates men to each other through the commodities they exchange. The social status of individuals, their standard of living, the satisfaction of their needs, their freedom, and their power are all determined by the value of their commodities. The capacities and needs of the individual have no part in the evaluation. Even man's most human attributes become a function of money, the general substitute for commodities. Individuals participate in the social process as owners of commodities only. Their mutual relations are those of their commodities. Capitalist commodity production has this mystifying result, that it transforms the social relations of individuals into qualities of things themselves, commodities, and still more pronouncedly transforms the interrelations of production themselves into a thing, money. The mystifying result arises from the specific mode of labor in commodity production. with its separate individuals working independently of each other and fulfilling their own needs only through those of the market. The fetishism of commodities has its origin in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them. As a general rule, articles of utility become commodities only because they are products of the labor of private individuals or groups of individuals who carry on their work independently of each other. The sum total of the labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Since the producers do not come into contact with each other until they exchange their products, the specific social character of each producer's labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange. In other words, the labor of the individual asserts itself as a product of the labor of society, only by means of the relations which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products and indirectly through them between the producers. To the latter, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but as what they really are, material relations between persons, and social relations between things. What does this reification accomplish? It sets forth the actual social relations among men as a totality of objective relations, thereby concealing their origin, their mechanisms of perpetuation, and the possibility of their transformation. Above all, it conceals their human core and content. If wages, as the reification process would indicate, express the value of labor, exploitation is at best a subjective and personal judgment. If capital were nothing other than an aggregate of wealth employed in commodity production, then capital would appear to be the cumulative result of productive skill and diligence. If the creation of profits were the peculiar quality of utilized capital, such profits might represent a reward for the work of the entrepreneur. The relation between capital and labor on this basis would involve neither iniquity nor oppression. It would rather be a purely objective material relationship, and economic theory would be a specialized science like any other. The laws of supply and demand, the fixing of value and prices, the business cycles, and so on, would be amenable to study as objective laws and facts, regardless of their effect on human existence. The economic process of society would be a natural process, and man, with all his needs and desires, would play in it the role of an objective mathematical quantum rather than that of a conscious subject. Marxian theory rejects such a science of economics and sets in its place the interpretation that economic relations are existential relations between men. It does this not by virtue of any humanitarian feeling, but by virtue of the actual content of the economy itself. Economic relations only seem to be objective because of the character of commodity production. As soon as one delves beneath this mode of production and analyzes its origin, one can see that its natural objectivity is mere semblance, while in reality it is a specific historical form of existence that man has given himself. Moreover, once this content comes to the fore, economic theory would turn into a critical theory. When one speaks of private property, one thinks he is dealing with something outside of man. When one speaks of labor, one has to do immediately with man himself. The new formulation of the question already involves its solution. As soon as their mystifying character is uncovered, economic conditions appear as the complete negation of humanity. The mode of labor perverts all human faculties. Accumulation of wealth intensifies poverty, and technological progress leads to the rule of dead matter over the human world. Objective facts come alive and enter an indictment of society. Economic realities exhibit their own inherent negativity. We are here touching upon the origins of the Marxian dialectic. For Marx, as for Hegel, the dialectic takes note of the fact that the negation inherent in reality is moving and creative principle. The dialectic is the dialectic of negativity. Every fact is more than a mere fact. It is a negation and restriction of real possibilities. Wage labor is a fact, but at the same time, it is a restraint on free work that might satisfy human needs. Private property is a fact, but at the same time, it is a negation of man's collective appropriation of nature. Man's social practice embodies the negativity as well as its overcoming. The negativity of capitalist society lies in its alienation of labor. The negation of this negativity will come with the abolition of alienated labor. Alienation has taken its most universal form in the institution of private property. Amends will be made with the abolition of private property. It is of the utmost importance to note that Marx views the abolition of private property entirely as a means for the abolition of alienated labor, and not as an end in itself. The socialization of the means of production is as such merely an economic fact, just like any other economic institution. Its claim to be the beginning of a new social order depends on what man does with the socialized means of production. If these are not utilized for the development and gratification of the free individual, they will amount simply to a new form for subjugating individuals to a hypostasized universality. The abolition of private property inaugurates an essentially new social system. Only if free individuals, and not the society, become masters of the socialized means of production. Marx expressly warns against such another reification of society. One must, above all, avoid setting the society up again as an abstraction opposed to the individual. The individual is the social entity. The expression of his life is therefore an expression and verification of the life of society. The true history of mankind will be, in the strict sense, the history of free individuals, so that the interest of the whole will be woven into the individual existence of each. In all prior forms of society, the interest of the whole lay in separate social and political institutions, which represented the right of society as against the right of the individual. The abolition of private property will do away with all this once and for all, for it will mark man's return from family, religion, state, etc. to his human, that is, social existence. It is then the free individuals and not a new system of production that exemplify the fact that the particular and the common interest have been merged. The individual is the goal. This individualistic trend is fundamental as an interest of the Marxian theory. We have shown the role of the universal in the traditional theories, placing stress on the fact that human fulfillment, what we have called the truth exemplified, could only be conceived in terms of the abstract universal concept so long as society retained the form it had. Shot through with a conflict at every hand among individual interests, the concrete conditions of social life made a mockery of the universal essence of man and nature, and since the prevailing social realities contradicted that essence, and hence contradicted the truth, the latter had no refuge save the mind, where it was hypostasized as an abstract universal. Marx explains how this state of affairs came about, showing its origin in the division of labor of class society, and particularly in the divorce that was entailed between the intellectual and material forces of production. The forces of production, the state of society and consciousness, can and must come into contradiction with one another, because the division of labor implies the possibility, nay, the fact that intellectual and material activity, enjoyment and labor, production and consumption devolve on different individuals. The division of labor manifests itself also in the ruling class as the division of mental and material labor, so that inside this class one part appears as the thinkers of the class, while the other's attitude to these ideas and illusions is more passive and receptive, because they are in reality the active members of this class and have less time to make up illusions and ideas about themselves. It is self-evident that phantoms like the higher being notion are merely the idealistic spiritual expression, the conception apparently of the isolated individual, the image of very empirical fetters and limitations within which the mode of production of life and the form of intercourse coupled with it move. Just as materially the reproduction of the social whole was the result of blind forces over which man's conscious powers exercised no guidance, so mentally the universal came forth as a reality that was independent and creative. The groups governing society were compelled to hide the fact that their interests were private by cloaking them in the dignity of the universal. Each new class which puts itself in the place of one ruling before it is compelled, merely in order to carry through its aim, to represent its interest as the common interest of all the members of society. It will give its ideas the form of universality and represent them as the only rational, universally valid ones. The claim of universality for the ideas of a ruling class is thus part of the mechanisms of class rule, and the critique of class society will also destroy its philosophical claims. The universal concepts employed are at first those hypostatizing desired forms of human existence, concepts like reason, freedom, justice, and virtue, and also state, society, democracy. All of these envisage that man's universal essence is materialized either within the prevailing social conditions or beyond them in a supra-historical realm. Marx also points to the fact that such concepts become increasingly universal in scope with the advance of the society. The ideas of honor, loyalty, and so on, which characterized medieval times and which were the dominant ideas of the aristocracy, were far more restricted in appeal and applied fewer persons than the ideas of freedom, equality, and justice of the bourgeoisie, which reflect the more far-reaching base of that class. The development of dominant ideas thus keeps step with and mirrors an increasing social and economic integration. The most general abstractions commonly arise only where there is the highest concrete development, where one feature seems to be jointly possessed by many and to be common to all. Then it cannot be thought of any longer in one particular form. The more society advances, the more do abstract ideas hold sway. That is, ideas which increasingly take on the form of universality. This process, however, turns into its opposite as soon as classes are abolished, and the interest of the whole is fulfilled in the existence of every individual. For then it is no longer necessary to represent a particular interest as general, or the general interest as ruling. The individual becomes the actual subject of history in such a way that he is himself the universal and manifests the universal essence of man. Communism, with its positive abolition of private property, is thus of its very nature a new form of individualism, and not only a new and different economic system, but a different system of life. Communism is the real appropriation of the essence of man by and for man. Therefore, it is man's complete conscious return to himself as a social, that is, human being. It is the true solution of man's conflict with nature and with man, of the strife between existence and essence, reification and self-determination, liberty and necessity, individual and genus. The contradictions that lay beneath the philosophy of Hegel and all traditional philosophy will dissolve in this new form of society. For these are historical contradictions rooted in the antagonisms of class society. Philosophical ideas express material historical conditions, which cast off their philosophical form as soon as they are subjected to the scrutiny of critical theory. And are seized by conscious and social practice. Hegel's philosophy revolved about the universality of reason. It was a rational system with its every part, the subjective as well as the objective spheres, integrated into a comprehensive whole. Marx shows that capitalist society first put such a universality into practice. Capitalism developed the productive forces for the totality of a uniform social system. Universal commerce, universal competition, and the universal independence of labor were made to prevail and transformed men into world historical empirically universal individuals. This universality, however, as we have explained, is a negative one, for the productive forces are used, as are the things man produces with them, in a way that makes them seem the products of an uncontrolled alien power. It is an empirical fact that separate individuals have, with the broadening of their activity into world historical activity, become more and more enslaved under a power alien to them, a power which has become more and more enormous, and in the last instance, turns out to be the world's market. The distribution of supply under international commodity production is a blind and anarchic universal process, wherein the demand of the individual is satisfied only if he can meet the requirements of exchange. Marx calls this anarchic relation of supply to demand a natural form of social integration, meaning that it seems to have the force of a natural law instead of operating as it should under the joint control of all men.